There is a document in the Massachusetts State Archives. It is 4 pages long. It was signed on May 18, 1852. And if you read it carefully, not the summary, not the textbook version, but the actual document, it does not say what you think it says. Before I go any further, I want to ask you something. Think about your own schooling. The bells, the grades, the rows of desks, the permission to use the bathroom. Did any of that ever strike you as strange? Leave your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you remember. Now, let's go back to 1852. The story most people know goes like this. America was growing fast. Cities were filling up. Children were working in factories instead of learning to read. And forward-thinking reformers decided to fix that by making education mandatory. Horace Mann, brilliant, idealistic, progressive, championed the cause, and Massachusetts led the way. The rest of the country followed. By 1918, every single state had compulsory attendance laws. Children learned to read. Literacy went up. Democracy was saved. That is the story. It is not wrong, exactly. It is just incomplete in ways that, once you see them, you cannot unsee. I want to be transparent about something. I was not researching compulsory education when I found this. I was looking into the history of child labor reform in the industrial Northeast, and I kept stumbling into a different story running alongside the one I expected. Quieter, less cited, but documented. Government records, legislative transcripts, the actual words of the men who designed this system. The deeper I went, the more certain I became that the law passed in 1852 was not primarily about helping children learn. It was about something else entirely. Horace Mann was born in 1796 in Franklin, Massachusetts. He grew up poor, largely self-taught, went on to study at Brown University, became a lawyer, entered the Massachusetts state legislature in 1827, and by 1837 was appointed the first secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education. He was, by any measure, a serious and consequential man. He believed deeply in education. He traveled to Europe in 1843 to study school systems, visiting several countries. But one country left an impression on him that would shape American childhood for the next 2 centuries. Prussia. The Prussian school system had been built in the early 1800s following a military catastrophe. After Prussia's humiliating defeat by Napoleon at the Battle of Jena in 1806, Prussian leaders concluded that their soldiers lacked something fundamental. Not courage, but the ability to think independently on a battlefield. So they rebuilt their education system from the ground up. Compulsory, state-run, standardized. The same curriculum delivered the same way to every child in the kingdom. The philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte was the intellectual architect of this system. In 1807, in his Addresses to the German Nation, Fichte wrote with remarkable candor about what this new education was supposed to accomplish. He said that the new system must fashion the person in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will. Let me read that again. Cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will. This was not a man hiding his intentions. This was the philosophical foundation of the system that Horace Mann brought home from Prussia in 1843 and presented to the Massachusetts Board of Education as a model for American children. Mann's 7th Annual Report of the Board of Education, published in 1843, is a public document. It is effusive in its praise of the Prussian system, the trained teachers, the grade levels, the standardized curriculum, the systematic reporting. Mann describes it as the most admirable school system he had ever encountered. He does not linger on what the system was originally designed to produce. He focuses on its efficiency. Now, here is what most people telling this story get wrong. They frame it as either a heroic education reform or a dark conspiracy. Neither framing is accurate, and both will lose you the thread. I spent considerable time reviewing the legislative record around the 1852 law, and the picture it reveals is more nuanced and in some ways more disturbing than a simple conspiracy. Because the men who designed this system largely believed in what they were doing. They believed it was necessary. That is precisely what makes the historical record so worth examining. What was happening in Massachusetts in the years immediately before 1852? Two things simultaneously. First, the Great Irish Famine. Between 1845 and 1852, over 1 million Irish fled starvation and arrived on American shores. A disproportionate number landed in Boston. By 1850, the Irish were the single largest ethnic group in the city of Boston, and virtually all of them were Catholic, working class, and deeply resistant to assimilation into Protestant New England culture. Second, and this is the part that rarely makes it into the textbooks, in 1850, 2 years before the compulsory education law was passed, the Massachusetts state legislature described these new arrivals in the following terms, recorded in their own transcripts. The immigrants now arriving, they wrote, are wholly of another kind in morals and intellect. Wholly of another kind in morals and intellect. That sentence was written by the same legislature that would pass the compulsory attendance law 24 months later. The same legislature that was simultaneously building a system of public schools where, as would become law by 1854, every child was required to read daily from the King James Protestant Bible. The Catholic version was not acceptable. The Catholic schools these families had built for their own children were not acceptable. The law said public school. The public schools said Protestant. This is where one specific child becomes important. In 1859, a 10-year-old Catholic boy named Thomas Wall attended the Eliot School in Boston, a public school, as the law required. His teacher, a man named McLaurin Cook, ordered the class to recite the 10 Commandments from the King James Bible. Thomas Wall refused. He was a Catholic. His faith used a different version. He refused. Cook beat him. The documented account described the beating as severe. Thomas Wall continued to refuse. Within days, over 300 Irish Catholic boys walked out of the Eliot School in protest. It became known as the Eliot School Rebellion of 1859. It was covered in Boston newspapers. A court case followed. The judge ruled that Protestant Bible readings in public school were entirely legal. Parents had no recourse. The law of mandatory attendance had put those children in that room, and it kept them there. Schools were supposed to be places of opportunity. For Thomas Wall, the mandatory school was a room where the state told him his faith was wrong, and backed that up with physical force. This is where the reasonable explanation begins to strain. The standard defense of compulsory education, the one you'll find in most academic histories, is that the law was primarily about economic uplift and civic integration. Children working in factories needed protection. The poor needed access to education they couldn't afford. These were real problems, and the law addressed them. Reasonable. Except for one detail. White male literacy in the United States in 1870, 18 years after the first compulsory attendance law, was already hovering around 80% in the North. Without compulsion. People were already educating their children through private schools, church schools, dame schools, apprenticeships, and home instruction. The 1840 census showed that roughly 55% of children between 5 and 15 were already attending some form of primary school, before any law required them to. Horace Mann knew this. He had personally visited every school in Massachusetts before his trip to Prussia. And here is the detail I keep returning to. Mann homeschooled his own 3 children. While he was lobbying to make school attendance mandatory for every other child in Massachusetts, he was personally educating his own children at home. He wrote in his 4th lecture on education in 1840 that strong parental bonds were obstacles to state education. A perennial force, he called it, that worked against the goals of the reformers. He saw the parent-child relationship as a problem to be managed. Now let me stack what the record actually shows, not as a conspiracy, as a sequence. In 1807, Prussian philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte publishes a framework for education whose explicit goal is the destruction of independent will in students. In 1806, Prussia had been defeated militarily and needed obedient citizens. In 1837, Horace Mann becomes secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education amid rapid industrialization and surging Catholic immigration. In 1843, Mann travels to Prussia, returns with an enthusiastic report praising the Prussian model, and begins lobbying for a state-controlled compulsory system. In 1845, the Great Irish Famine begins sending hundreds of thousands of Catholic immigrants to New England. In 1850, the Massachusetts legislature formally records its alarm at the character of new immigrants, their words in their transcripts. In 1852, on May 18th, Massachusetts passes an act concerning the attendance of children at school, requiring children ages 8 to 14 to attend state-approved schools for at least 12 weeks per year, with fines for noncompliance. In 1854, the Know Nothing Party, explicitly anti-Catholic, sweeps the Massachusetts legislature and mandates Protestant Bible reading in those same mandatory public schools. In 1859, Thomas Wall is beaten in a Boston public school for refusing to recite a Protestant scripture. In 1862, Massachusetts makes jailing of habitual truants mandatory and extends the age range from 7 to 16. By 1918, every state in the country has compulsory education laws. Each of those steps, taken alone, has a reasonable explanation. Together, they describe a system designed at least as much to reshape the values and identities of children as to teach them arithmetic. The Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Ford Foundation would later become the primary financial architects of what the American public school curriculum would actually contain. Industrial-era foundations shaping the minds of children who would grow up to work in industrial-era factories. The 1960s federal report, Designing Education for the Future, produced through a collaboration between private foundations and the U.S. Office of Education, described the purpose of schooling explicitly as achieving important economic and social goals of a national character. Individual school districts were instructed, in that report, to lose their independent identity as well as their authority. That phrase was written in 1966, 114 years after the Massachusetts law. The architecture has not changed. Now, I need to be honest about what I am not claiming. I am not claiming that everyone who built and defended public schools was acting in bad faith. Many were not. Literacy did expand. Opportunities did open for children who would otherwise have had none. Child labor declined. These are real outcomes, and they matter. What I am saying is that the documented record shows a system whose origins included, alongside genuine educational idealism, a deliberate mechanism for cultural conformity. A mechanism designed, in part, by men who looked at immigrant families and saw, in their own words, people wholly of another kind in morals and intellect, and who built an institution to change that, compulsorily, under penalty of fine, under threat of losing custody of your children. And I am saying that the same 4-page document sitting in the Massachusetts State Archives, the one signed on May 18, 1852, launched that system. You could go and read it today. It's archived. It's public. It says what it says. Here is what I can't stop thinking about. Thomas Wall was 10 years old when he was beaten in a Boston schoolroom for refusing to read from the wrong Bible. He did not choose to be in that room. The law put him there. The same law that is still, in its fundamental structure, the law governing where your children spend 7 hours a day. We tend to assume that institutions built in one era with certain motives naturally shed those motives over time, that the purpose evolves, that the original design becomes irrelevant. Maybe, maybe not. The question I keep coming back to, and I genuinely don't have an answer, is this. If a system was originally designed, in part, to make children incapable of willing otherwise than what the state wished them to will, how would you know if it had stopped doing that? If that question sits with you, subscribe. There is more to this thread than one video can hold.